Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillah. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah wa alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Some of you were expecting, as indeed have been promised, a question and answer session this morning, but in fact I'm going to defer that until later on, 10 o'clock inshallah. We'll be back here if any of you do have questions, because I did want to finish off the 20 masail or afat, defects of the tongue, which Imam Al Ghazali has promised in his book, and inshallah we'll be able to get through them this morning. And you may recall that we had broached what for the Imam really is the most complex of these 20 last time, specifically afatul ghiba, the defect of backbiting. And no prizes for guessing why he considers this both to be important and complicated. Important because it's so widespread and because there's such a strong Quranic denunciation. It's dishonorable, it's exploiting the vulnerabilities of others, it gratifies the ego. He's going to explain this in his brilliant psychologizing way shortly. Complicated because there are certain judgments that we have to make which are often difficult as to when it might actually be permissible or even necessary to criticize somebody else behind their back, and he's going to deploy his exposition of that in due course. So I'm going to pick up in one of his sections. He gives a section which we won't have time to look at, which is that there can be forms of backbiting which are non-verbal, so certain kinds of gestures or facial expressions and body language. But the one I want to begin with is called Bayanul Asbab al-Ba'ithati al-Ghiba, an exposition of the motives for backbiting. This is characteristically Ghazalian. He psychologizes everything. He wants to know not just what a sin is, but also how we can put it right, and beyond that to understand why we should be involving ourselves in it in the first place. And a lot of ethical texts tend to neglect this, but partly because of his strongly Ash'ari view of human accountability. For him, intentionality and therefore the generation of acts is in a sense the most important thing to understand, not just in terms of understanding their moral significance and the human level of accountability once we've carried those acts out, but also in terms of helping us to understand ourselves and to appreciate how we can change our intentionality so that these problems don't arise in future. So he says, اعلموا أن البواعث على الغيبة كثيرة. Know that there are many reasons why people might backbite. ولكن يجمعها أحد عشر سببا. And these can be summarized as 11 reasons. ثمانية منها تضرر في حق العامة. 8 of them are to do with the motivations of ordinary people. وثلاثة تختص بأهل الدين والخاصة. And there are 3 also which are particular motivations in the case of scholars and the religious elite. So very briefly to work through these. أما الثمانية, as for the first 8, فالأول أن يشفي الغيظ, that backbiting can heal one's rage. In other words, there's a certain therapy involved in criticizing others. You get things off your chest. وذلك إذا جرى سبب غضب به عليه فإنه إذا هاج غضبه يشتفي بذكر مساويه. And this is because if one is angry with something or with a particular person, then when one's anger is aroused, one can find a healing in mentioning the weaknesses of that person. So it's a way of getting one's own back, and a kind of backbiting therapy, we could call it. Number 2, الثاني موافقة الأقران ومجاملة الرفقاء. The second is in order to go along with one's friends and to please and flatter one's companions. ومساعدتهم على الكلام, and to help them in their conversations. فإنهم إذا كانوا يتفكهون بذكر الأعراض, when they amuse themselves by mentioning things that compromise the honor or dignity of others. فَيَرَى أَنَّهُ لَوْ أَنْكَرَ عَلَيْهِمْ, he thinks that if he was to object to this, أو قطع المجلس, or to leave, استثقلوا, they would consider him to be a kind of bore, heavy, a party pooper. وَنَفَرُوا عَنْ, and wouldn't want to be with him any longer. فَيُسَاعِدُهُمْ, so he goes along with them. وَيَرَى ذَلِكَ مِنْ حُسْنِ الْمُعَاشَرَةِ, and he considers that even to be part of the courtesy or the normal pattern of conversation. Number 3, الثالث أن يستشعر من إنسان أنه سيقصده ويطول لسانه عليه. The third is when we think that somebody might target us or might start to criticize us. أو يقبح حاله عند محتشم, or يقبح حاله, or might make us seem ugly or insignificant in the eyes of some important person. أو يشهد عليه بشهادة, or might bear witness against us, might testify against us. فيبادره, so he jumps the gun, he anticipates this. قبل أن يقبح هو حاله, before that person has a chance to impugn our own reputation. ويطعن في ليسقط أثر شهادته, so that the impact of what he says is diminished. So if you're afraid so-and-so is going to go to a judge, for instance, or to a friend, or to somebody who is significant and say bad things about you, you can undermine him by saying bad things about them and discrediting them in advance. And for the Imam, this is one of the reasons why human beings backbite each other, in order to defend themselves from the backbiting of others. Number 4, الرابع أن ينسب إلى شيء فيريد أن يتبرأ منه. The fourth is when we are attributed to a particular practice and we want to dissociate ourselves from it. فيذكر الذي فعله وكان من حقه أن يبرئ نفسه ولا يذكر الذي فعل فلا ينسب غيره إليه أو يذكر غيره بأنه كان مشاركا له في الفعل ليمهد بذلك عذر نفسه في فعله. So what it's saying is that sometimes if we are being accused of something, we can escape that accusation by being very self-righteous and accusing somebody else of that particular practice. Or we can say, well, all right, I did such and such a thing, but so-and-so also did it. In which case we kind of self-exculpate ourselves. Yes, I know I haven't done many optional fasts this year, but you know, Sheikh so-and-so, he didn't do many, and so-and-so didn't do many. That's also a form of backbiting, and this is a way of exculpating oneself. And the sixth, the fifth, الخامس إرادة التصنع والمباهات. وهو أن يرفع نفسه بتنقيص غيره فيقول فلان جاهل وفهمه ركيك. Motive number 5 for backbiting is in order to magnify oneself and to boast and to proclaim one's own superiority by means of demeaning others, so that for this reason we say so-and-so is ignorant and his understanding of this is feeble. So it's in order to justify ourselves that we can backbite others. As-sadis, the sixth, al-hasad. Number 6 is envy, which is related to the previous one. وهو أنه ربما يحسد من يثني الناس عليه. We might sometimes be jealous of people who are being praised by others. ويحبونه ويكرمونه, and they love him and they honor him, and we feel jealous about this. فيريد زوال تلك النعمة عنه, and we want that prestige, that status, that love to depart from that person because we'd like to have it for ourselves, the celebrity status. فلا يجد سبيلا إليه إلا بالقدح فيه, and we find no means of confiscating somebody else's good name and status and popularity other than backbiting and mentioning in public their weaknesses. Number 7, السابع اللعب والهزل والمطايبة وتزجية الوقت بالضحك. Number 7 is just to have fun and to horse around and entertainment and to enliven one's time with laughter. فَيَذْكُرُ عُيُوبَ غَيْرِهِ بِمَا يُضْحِكُ النَّاسِ. So he mentions other people's faults in order to make people laugh. عَلَى سَبِيلِ الْمُحَاكَاةِ, by means of, for instance, imitating them in a comical way. وَمَنْشَأُهُ التَّكَبُّرُ وَالْعُجْبُ. And the reason for this is arrogance and conceit. Number 8, الثامن السخرية والاستهزاء استحقارا له. Number 8 is mockery and contempt and having a low opinion of somebody else. If we have a low opinion of somebody, that may well incline us to backbite them. فإن ذلك قد يجري في الحضور ويجري أيضا في الغيبة. So we might express our contempt for somebody in their presence, but also when they're not around. ومنشأه التكبر واستصغار المستهزئ به. And the motive for this, again, is arrogance and belittling the one whom we are mocking. So those are the 8 reasons why people backbite that are sort of commonplace amongst society at large. أما الأسباب الثلاثة التي هي في الخاصة. As for the 3 motives which exist amongst the kind of religious class, فهي أغمضها وأدقها. These are more subtle and more obscure. لأنها شرور خبأها الشيطان في معرض الخيرات. Because they're sources of evil which the devil has buried in discourses which are about virtues. وفيها خير ولكن شاب الشيطان بها الشر. On the surface, these discourses represent pious discourses, but the devil has polluted them with evil. So these are the 3. الأول أن تنبعث من الدين داعية التعجب في إنكار المنكر. The first is when, as a result of religious affiliation, the motivation of self-satisfaction appears when condemning what is munkar, what is reprehensible, والخطأ في الدين, and condemning mistakes in religion. فيقول ما أعجب ما رأيت من فلان. So we might say, the strange thing that I saw somebody doing. فإنه قد يكون به صادقا ويكون تعجبه من المنكر. It may well be that he is true, he is right in making this criticism, but his amazement at somebody else's bad practice may be a legitimate amazement. ولكن كان حقه أن يتعجب ولا يذكر اسمه. But what was his duty was to be amazed, but not to mention the name of that person. And this, again, he's really talking about religious discourse, wa'az, khutbahs, sermon situations, where the khatib or the speaker may be tempted to point accusing fingers at named individuals. الثاني الرحمة. فيقول مسكين فلان قد غمني أمره. So we might say, poor old so-and-so, I'm really sad for him. وما ابتلي به, and sad because of the trial that has afflicted him. فيكون صادقا في دعوى الاغتمام. He may well be correct in claiming to be sad for that person. ويلهيه الغم عن الحذر من ذكر اسمه. But that sadness causes him to forget that he shouldn't mention his name. And once he mentions his name, فَيَصِيرُ بِهِ مُغْتَابًا, he becomes a backbiter. And the third, الثالث الغضب لله تعالى. The third is when we are angry for the sake of God. فإنه قد يغضب على منكر قارفه إنسان إذا رآه أو سمعه فيظهر غضبه ويذكر اسمه. Sometimes we may feel angry because of some vice which has been committed by a particular person when we see it or hear it, and we become so angry that we mention that person's name. وكان الواجب أن يظهر غضبه عليه بالأمر بالمعروف والنهي عن المنكر. The correct way to manifest one's anger in such a situation is to command what is good and to forbid what is evil. وَلَا يُظْهِرَهُ عَلَى غَيْرِهِ, rather than mentioning that person's vice to others. فهذه الثلاثة مما يغمض تركها في العلماء. So these are the three forms of backbiting which are subtle and veiled amongst the ulama, فضلا عن العوام, and also present in the common people. Again, a reminder of the fact that you could say that the principal readership which Ghazali is aiming for in the Ihya is actually his own colleagues. This is a big book. It's not going to be bought in the souk by casual passers-by. It's a serious manual, a polemical manual directed against the scholars of his time who he saw were outwardly often impeccable, but inwardly contained all kinds of defects. And you'll remember the point that we made when we started off, which is that for Ghazali, all of these complex and actually quite brilliant, psychologically acute ethical observations and proposed remedies are part of his epistemological agenda. That is to say, they put us right so that the human subject becomes in control of its ego and hence able to make the right choices in doctrine and in philosophy. So all of this ethical stuff is actually not just sort of pietism, but is part of a complete program of religious knowledge. Yeah. Then he has a section on how to cure oneself of the vice of backbiting, which unfortunately we don't have time for. But just briefly to cite another important section, which again is so Ghazalian, بيان تحريم الغيبة بالقلب, an exposition of why backbiting in the heart is forbidden. اعلم أن سوء الظن حرام مثل سوء القول. Know that to harbour a bad opinion of somebody is forbidden, just as to utter a bad word about somebody. فكما يحرم عليك أن تحدث غيرك بلسانك بمساوي الغير. So just as it is forbidden for you to use your tongue to chatter about the faults of others, فليس لك أن تحدث نفسك. Similarly, you don't have the right to speak to yourself about other people's faults. وتسيء الظن بأخيك, and to have a low opinion of your brother. ولست أعني به إلا عقد القلب وحكمه على غيره بالسوء. And what I mean here is simply, he says, to have a determined perception and judgment in the heart that somebody else is doing something that is wrong and despicable. فأما الخواطر وحديث النفس, as for passing thoughts, undirected thoughts in the mind, فهو معفو عن, this is forgivable, that doesn't constitute backbiting. بل الشك أيضا معفو عن. And similarly to doubt momentarily about what is somebody doing, that is also forgivable. So for instance, if you're in Ramadan and you go past a restaurant and somebody you know from your jama'ah is in there at lunchtime happily tucking into a pizza, it's not just backbiting to tell everybody, oh, I saw somebody having a pizza at the restaurant, but it's backbiting if you also tell yourself in this aqd al-qalb way, with a determined heart, this person has got a problem with his fasting. If you just wonder, the moment you see him, well, is he fasting or not? That's shak. Or if it's just a kind of passing thought, well, maybe he's not fasting. Those are just accidental thoughts that come into the mind. That's not a sin, because you're not responsible for that. But if you really make up your mind that this person is committing a sin, rather than saying, well, maybe he's sick, or maybe he's traveling, or the other possible excuses that could well be the case, then he says you are actually a backbiter, even if you've not opened your mouth. So passing thoughts are not accountable. We're not to blame just for the initial moment of doubt. وَلَكِنَ الْمَنْهِيَ عَنْهُ أَنْ يَظُنَّ. What is forbidden is to harbour a suspicion. وَالظَّنُّ عِبَارَةٌ عَمَّا تَرْكَنُ إِلَيْهِ النَّفْسِ. And suspicion, by suspicion we mean that which the soul, the nafs, inclines to. فَقَدْ قَالَ اللَّهُ تَعَالَى يا أيها الذين آمنوا اجتنبوا كثيرا من الظن إن بعض الظن إثم. Allah says, O you who have Iman, avoid much suspicion. Much suspicion is a sin. And Ghazali has some important things to say elsewhere, particularly where he talks about disciplining our inward life, which is hugely important for him. The two things that characterize our inward life are the kind of stream of consciousness, chit-chat of images and thoughts, and usually driven by the ego. And there is also the possibility of a more rigorous disciplined discourse when the human subject actually is in charge. And it's that latter one that becomes religiously significant. But it only becomes truly who we are and what dominates our thoughts if the other category is regimented as much as possible and doesn't sort of drive us. This comes up particularly in his book on intention, Kitab an-Niyya, which is really one of the most difficult and subtle books in the Ihya, because he gets into questions of predestination and are your intentions predetermined or are they part of the ruh? It's a subtle book, but many of these issues to do with what is blameworthy. Is it just a passing thought, a passing desire, or is it your determined actions are dealt with in the Kitab an-Niyya, the book of intention. So then he moves on. He's still talking about backbiting to another section where he deals with something that is again practical and important. بيان الأعذار المرخصة في الغيبة, an exposition of excuses and justifications for backbiting. In other words, there are certain situations where we're not sure whether we should be criticizing somebody publicly or not. And how to make that differentiation is often a subtle thing. اعلم أن المرخص في ذكر مساوي الغير هو غرض صحيح في الشرع. Know that المرخص في ذكر مساوي الغير, it is a legitimate purpose of that there may be a legitimate Sharia purpose which allows one to mention the faults of others. لا يمكن التوصل إليه إلا به, and that Sharia purpose can only be achieved by mentioning the faults of others in certain circumstances. فيدفع ذلك إثم الغيبة, and this abolishes or dismisses the sin of backbiting. وهي ستة أمور, and there are 6 justifications for speaking publicly about the sins of others. So here goes. الأول التظلم. Firstly is where you are making a claim against somebody who has wronged you. فإن من ذكر قاضيا بالظلم والخيانة وأخذ الرشوة, etc. So if you go to a judge complaining about maltreatment or betrayal, or somebody who is taking money from you through usury, in that situation, in a legal case, you have to name the guilty party, and that's not sinful. The courts can't operate unless both parties are named. And of course, then as now, it's often in the context of legal battles that people hurl imprecations and try to discredit each other as much as possible. It's often an ugly aspect of the legal profession, brings out the worst in us. But he's saying you cannot operate as a qadi unless you ask people to say who the guilty party allegedly is. الثاني, number 2, الاستغاثة على تغيير المنكر ورد المعاصي إلى منهج الصلاح. Secondly, when asking for help in changing something which is ugly or abominable, and to correct sins so that the path of righteousness is re-established. So in this case, it would be, for instance, if somebody is mugging somebody, doing something where you have an immediate obligation to intervene and you need other people to help you, then you need to say, so-and-so, Abu Fulan, is committing this this crime so that people will then rally around. الثالث الاستفتاء. Third is when asking for a religious judgment or fatwa. كما يقول للفتوى ظلمني أبي أو زوجتي أو أخي. So if you go to the mufti and say, there's this situation where my father has wronged me, or my wife has wronged me, or my brother has wronged me. And then he says, but in these situations, if you can do it bit-ta'rid, in other words, without naming the individuals, is better. If you can ask for a fatwa without specifying names and just saying, imagine there's this situation where there's somebody who is wronged by his father, what should the judgment be? And almost invariably you'll find in fatwas that they will speak about the anonymous Zayd and Amr, two fictional characters. They won't talk about specific individuals. It's not like, say, English case law where the names of the litigants are forever present in the name of the legal judgment. Anonymity, he says, is, where possible, preferable. So that's number 3. 4. الرابع تحذير المسلم من الشر. The fourth is to warn another Muslim against some evil. فإذا رأيت فقيها يتردد إلى مبتدع. So if you see a religious scholar spending a lot of time with an innovator, أو فاسق, or a corrupt, decadent person, وخفت أن تتعدى إليه بدعته, and you're afraid that that person's innovation or fisq or corruption might spread to him, فلك أن تكشف له بدعته وفسقه. Then it is permissible for you to reveal to him that person's innovation and his corruption. So if the imam of your mosque is an innocent person and is hanging out with somebody who's teaching him, and you know that that person who's teaching him has a particular vice or a particular incorrect doctrine, then it's permissible for you to mention to that religious leader that he should watch out for that person's inclination. Al-Khamis, number 5, أن يكون الإنسان معروفا باللقب يعرف عن عيبه كالأعرج والأعمش. And the 5th is where somebody is actually known publicly through some sobriquet or nickname. So somebody is called Ahmad the Blind, for instance, or Majid the Hunchback. If that's a kind of public name for him and he doesn't object to it, then it's considered permissible to use that name. السادس, this is the 6th of them. السادس أن يكون مجاهرا بالفسق. The 6th is the case of the person who makes his corruption public and is proud of it. كالمخنث, this is like an effeminate person or a transvestite. وصاحب الماخور, or the owner of a tavern. والمجاهر بشرب الخمر, and somebody goes about publicly announcing that he drinks wine. ومصادرة الناس, and confiscates people's property. وكان ممن يتظاهر به, and is somebody who makes a public show of it, بحيث لا يستنكف من أن يذكر له, to the extent that he doesn't mind if people mention it. فإن ذكرت به ما يتظاهر به فلا إثم عليك. So if you mention in public the evil practice of this person who's already making it public himself, then there is no sin upon you. قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم من ألقى جلباب الحياء عن وجهه فلا غيبة له. The Holy Prophet says, whoever unveils himself as an immodest person, there is no backbiting against him. In other words, if he's already immodestly proclaiming a particular thing, making it public, then it's not backbiting if you mention the fact that he is subject to this particular vice. And again, this section goes on. There's still more about backbiting. I mentioned this is the most complex one. The last section, which again we won't have time to read through, is bayanu kafaratil ghiba, an exposition of how to atone for backbiting. It's not just enough to know that you should stop, but how can you put it right? If you have wounded somebody with your words or done harm, how can you erase that sin? And of course it means putting it right, publicly reversing your negative opinion of him and other practices, including tawbah. But we don't have time for that. Al-afatu sadisa ashara, defect number 16, an-namima, which is tale-bearing. This is a good deal simpler. قال الله تعالى هماز مشاء بنميم, whispering, walking around with tale-bearing. قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم أحبكم إلى الله أحاسنكم أخلاقا المطيئون أكنافا الذين يألفون ويؤلفون which means, this is a hadith, the most beloved of you to Allah are those with the most beautiful character, those who are in a state of gentle solidarity, الذين يألفون ويؤلفون, those who are at ease with others and make others feel at ease. وَإِنَّ أَبْغَضَكُمْ إِلَى اللَّهِ, and the most detestable of you to Allah, الْمَشَّاءُونَ بِالنَّمِيمَةِ, are those who walk around bearing tales, stories about others. الْمُفَرِّقُونَ بَيْنَ الْإِخْوَانِ, who divide brothers. الْمُلْتَمِسُونَ لِلْبُرَآءِ الْعَثَرَاتِ, those who seek out or seek to discover faults in innocent people. So that's a good definition of what this namima means. And again, fast forwarding a little bit, I just wanted to mention this section, which is what to do, this time look at it from the other perspective, what to do if you are in the presence of somebody or some people who are bearing tales about somebody. Well, you know about Sheikh so-and-so, you know what he's doing now, and did you know, etc. It may not be backbiting as such, but it constitutes this tale-bearing, this kind of pleasure in casting ambiguities on others. So what should you do if you're in that situation and you hear these things? فَعَلَيْهِ سِتَّةُ أُمُورٍ, he should do 6 things. Al-awwal, أَلَّا يُصَدِّقَهُ, the first is that he simply shouldn't believe it. لِأَنَّ النَّمَّامَ فَاسِقٌ, because the talebearer is a corrupt person. وَهُوَ مَرْدُودُ الشَّهَادَةِ, and somebody who in Sharia cannot have his testimony accepted. قال الله تعالى يا أيها الذين آمنوا إن جاءكم فاسق بنبأ فتبينوا أن تصيبوا قوما بجهالة. Allah says, O you who have Iman, if a corrupt person comes to you with a piece of news, make sure, ascertain the truth of it, lest you should afflict some innocent people through ignorance. So that's the first, you just don't believe it. الثاني أن ينهاه عن ذلك. The second is that you should tell the person who's engaged in this chit-chat to stop. وَيَنْصَحُ لَهُ, and give him advice. وَيُقَبِّحُ عَلَيْهِ فَعْلًا, and to remind him that what he's doing is something ugly. قال الله تعالى وَأْمُرْ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ وَانْهَى عَنِ الْمُنْكَرِ. Allah says, command what is good and forbid what is evil. Response number 3, الثالث أن يبغضه في الله تعالى, that he should dislike him for the sake of Allah. فإنه بغيض عند الله تعالى, because this thing is hateful to Allah. ويجب بغض من يبغضه الله تعالى, and those who are doing something that is hateful to Allah should be considered hateful. الرابع ألا تظن بأخيك الغائب السوء. The fourth is that you should not think ill of your absent brother. لقول الله تعالى, because Allah has said, اجتنبوا كثيرا من الظن إن بعض الظن إثم. Avoid much suspicion is a sin. الخامس, the fifth, ألا يحملك ما حكي لك عن على التجسس, that the stories that you hear about a person should not impel you to spy on them. والبحث لتتحقق, so that you can make sure for yourself. You shouldn't be intrusive, you shouldn't spy on people because you've heard these rumors. اتباعا لقوله تعالى because we must follow Allah's word. وَلَا تَجَسَّسُوا, do not spy on one another. And the sixth and last, السادس, وَلَا تَحْكِي نَمِيمَتَهُ فَتَقُولْ فُلَانٌ قَدْ حَكَى لِي كَذَا وَكَذَا. You should not pass on this tale-bearing by saying, well, I don't know if it's true, but so-and-so told me such and such a thing. فَتَكُونُ بِهِ نَمَّامًا, because if you do this, you will also be a tale-bearer, or مُغْتَابًا, and a backbiter. وَتَكُونُ قَدْ أَتَيْتَ مَا عَنْهُ نَهِيتَ, and you will be somebody who has committed the thing which you are condemning that other person for doing. In other words, it's very bad of so-and-so to tell me this, but did you know? Well, it's also bad of you to do that, so you are condemned in your own words. So those are the six responses which we should have, according to the Imam, to situations in which other people are being mentioned in our presence in a negative light. And that brings us to number 17, Al-Afatu Sabi'atu Ashar, the 17th defect. Kalamu dhil lisanayn, literally the speech of the man with two tongues. And the normal English idiom here would be to be two-faced. الذي يتردد بين المتعاديين ويكلم كل واحد منهما بكلام يوافقه. Somebody who goes to two people who are in conflict with each other and speaks to each of them in a way that suggests that he's on his side, that he agrees with him. وقلما يخلو عنه من يشاهد متعاديين وذلك عين النفاق. And this very often happens. He says it's normally the case when you know two people who are in conflict with each other. وذلك عين النفاق, and this is the essence of hypocrisy. قال عمار بن ياسر قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم, the Holy Prophet said, من كان له وجهان في الدنيا كان له لسانان من نار يوم القيامة. Whoever had two faces in this world shall have two tongues of fire on the day of resurrection. قال أبو هريرة قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم, the Holy Prophet said, تجدون من شر عباد الله يوم القيامة ذا الوجهين. One of the worst of Allah's slaves on the day of judgment will be the two-faced man. الذي يأتي هؤلاء بحديث وهؤلاء بحديث, who says one thing with one group and another thing with another. وقال صلى الله عليه وسلم, and he also said, أبغض خليقة الله إلى الله يوم القيامة الكذابون والمستكبرون والذين يكثرون البغضاء لإخوانهم في صدورهم. The most hateful of Allah's creatures to him on the day of resurrection shall be the liars and the proud and those who spread and multiplied hatred for their brothers in their chests. فَإِذَا لَقُوهُمْ تَمَلَّقُوا لَهُمْ. When they meet them, they're all polite and friendly with them. وَالَّذِينَ إِذَا دُعُوا إِلَى اللَّهِ وَرَسُولِهِ كَانُوا بُطَآ. In other words, they're friendly with a particular group when they're with them, but when they're absent, they're spreading corrupt words about them. And when they are summoned to Allah and His Messenger, they are slow. وَإِذَا دُعُوا إِلَى الشَّيْطَانِ وَأَمْرِهِ كَانُوا سِرَاعًا. But when they're summoned to the shaitan and his business, they make haste. قال ابن مسعود, Ibn Mas'ud said, لا يكونن أحدكم إمعا. Not one of you should be imma. قالوا وما الإمع. And they said, well, what's an imma? قال الذي يجري مع كل ريح. He said, the one who blows with every wind. In other words, you modify your opinions and what you're saying in accordance with what pleases whoever you happen to be with. And this, he says, is to do with the essence of nifaq. And there's more that he says, but we don't have time for it. So that's number 17, to be two-faced. He does have an interesting disquisition in the middle of this, which is a practical issue for some, which is what to do when you're with a ruler or with powerful people. should you be a particular way with them, but not that particular way when you're with others? So you're with a ruler and you know that probably he's drinking alcohol and that he's really not particularly observant of religion, but nonetheless you kind of relax with him and you don't mention those things to him, and you help him because maybe you want some money from him or a job from him or have a particular need. And he says this is a complex thing, but generally the way of the ulama is always to be with the rulers as they are with the common people, and not to go along with the court culture of politeness and time-serving and hypocrisy. Al-afatu الثامنة عشرة, defect 18. Al-madh, praising. وهو منهي عنه في بعض المواضع. And this is, in certain circumstances, a forbidden thing. أما الذم فهو الغيبة والوقيعة. And it contrasts with condemnation. It's the opposite of condemnation, which is backbiting and insulting others. وَقَدْ ذَكَرْنَا حُكْمَهَا. We've already discussed backbiting. وَالْمَدْحِ, praising, يَدْخُلُهُ سِتُّ آفَاتٍ أَرْبَعٌ فِي الْمَادِحِ وَاثْنَتَانِ فِي الْمَمْدُوحِ. And as for praising, this is subject to 6 defects. 4 afflict the one who is praising, and 2 afflict the one who is being praised. فَأَمَّا الْمَادِحِ, as for the one who is praising, giving the praise, فَالْأَوْلَى أَنَّهُ قَدْ يُفْرِطْ فَيَنْتَهِي بِهِ إِلَى الْكَذِبِ. The greatest danger here is that he goes to excess in his praise and ends up being a liar. And that's always the risk when you're, even for the sake of politeness, and it's common in Oriental cultures endlessly to heap praises upon people when making speeches, and it becomes tedious after a while. And sometimes, he says, the danger with that is that you end up simply telling lies. الثانية, the second, أنه قد يدخله الرياء. Ostentation may afflict this or contaminate it. فإنه بالمدح مظهر للحب, because by praising somebody you are making a show of love for that person. وقد لا يكون مضمرا له, but in practice you may not inwardly love that person. ولا معتقد الجميع ما يقوله, and you may not actually believe all the things that you're saying. فيصير به مرائيا منافقا, and if you're like that, then you are ostentatious and a hypocrite. الثالثة أنه قد يكون ما لا يتحققه ولا سبيل له إلى الاطلاع عليه. The third is that you may be saying things that you're not really sure of and you have no means of ascertaining. الرابعة, the fourth, أنه قد يفرح الممدوح وهو ظالم أو فاسق وذلك غير جائز. The fourth is that you might bring joy, is that by bringing joy to the one you are praising, he may in fact turn out to be a tyrant, an unjust person, or a corrupt person, and that is impermissible. So those are the 4 defects of being a praiser. أما الممدوح, as for being praised, فيضره من وجهين, he is harmed by praise in 2 ways. أحدهما, the first, أنه يحدث فيه كبرا أو وإعجابا وهما مهلكان. The first is that it can bring about pride and conceit, and these are 2 mortal sins. And that's obvious, that's the obvious danger of being praised. الثاني هو أنه إذا أثنى عليه بالخير فرح به. The second is that when one is praised for a virtue, one feels joyful with that. وَفَطَرَ وَرَضِيَ عَنْ نَفْسِهِ, and therefore becomes complacent and becomes self-satisfied. وَمَنْ أُعْجِبَ بِنَفْسِهِ قَلَّ تَشَمُّرُهُ, and whoever is self-satisfied becomes lazy. وَإِنَّمَا يَتَشَمَّرُ لِلْعَمَلِ مَنْ يَرَى نَفْسَهُ مُقَصِّرًا. People who work really hard are always people who regard themselves as inadequate. So that's another way in which you're harming somebody by praising him all the time. You may come to believe this and may think, well, I'm all right, I'm a wonderful person, I needn't bother to improve my ibadah or to work hard. And that's another way in which by praising him you can damage him. فإن سلم المدح من هذه الآفات, if a praise is actually safe from these defects, في حق المادح والممدوح, in the case both of the praiser and the praised, لم يكن به بأس, there's nothing wrong with it. بل ربما كان مندوبا إليه, it may even be something that's commendable. ولذلك أثنى رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم على الصحابة, and it was in this spirit that the Holy Prophet praised the Sahaba. فقال لو وزن إيمان أبي بكر بإيمان العالم لرجح, so that he said, for instance, were Abu Bakr's iman to be weighed against the iman of the rest of the world, it would outweigh it. وقال في عمر, and he said about Umar, لو لم أبعث لبعثت يا عمر, and he said, had I not been made a prophet, you would have been made a prophet, O Umar. And he says, but the reason why this was permissible is that قاله صلى الله عليه وسلم عن صدق وبصيرة. He said these things absolutely sincerely and with a firm awareness. All right, then he has a section which we don't have time for, which is a guidance on what to do when you're being praised frequently. How should your inner state be? And often an awkward situation. Al-afatu at-tasi'atu ashar. Defect number 19. Al-ghaflatu an daqa'iq al-khata' fi fahwa al-kalam. To be heedless of subtle mistakes that one can make when speaking. لا سيما فيما يتعلق بالله وصفاته. Especially in connection with matters of metaphysics, the divine nature and his attributes. ويرتبط بأمور الدين. This is something that relates specifically to religious matters. فلا يقدر على تقويم اللفظ في أمور الدين إلا العلماء. Only the scholars are able to speak well about matters of religion. العلماء الفصحاء, articulate scholars. فمن قصر في علم أو فصاحة لم يخلو كلامه عن الزلل. So whoever's knowledge or eloquence is inadequate or defective, his speech will be prone to errors. لكن الله تعالى يعفو عنه لجهله. But Allah, inshallah, will forgive him because of his ignorance. ما قال حذيفة قال النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم لم يقل أحدكم ما شاء الله وشئت لا يقول أحدكم. So the Holy Prophet said, none of you should say ما شاء الله وشئت, Allah willed it and I willed it. It's an expression that is periodically heard in Arabic. ولكن وليقول ما شاء الله. Let him instead just say ما شاء الله and then ثم شئت. So this is the Holy Prophet himself making this same point. You shouldn't say, Allah willed and I willed it. You should say, Allah wished for such a thing and then I wished for it. You introduce a word between them. وَذَلِكَ لِأَنَّ فِي الْعَطْفِ الْمُطْلَقِ تَشْرِيكًا وَتَسْوِيَةً. And that's because putting them together is associating the divine with oneself and implicitly equating them. وَهُوَ عَلَى خِلَافِ الْإِحْتِرَامِ. And this is at the very least disrespectful. And again, he gives some other examples of this defect of the tongue, which pertains to inarticulate people or non-experts talking about subtle metaphysical things. He acknowledges this as a danger. And finally, we've reached number 20, Al-Afatul Ishrun, the 20th defect, which is a kind of corollary of the 19th. سؤال العوام عن صفات الله تعالى وعن كلامه وعن الحروف وأنها قديمة أو محدثة. Questions from ordinary, non-scholarly Muslims about the divine attributes and about his speech and about the letters of the Quran. Are they uncreated or are they created? ومن حقهم الاشتغال بالعمل بما في القرآن what is appropriate for them is to be busy with acting upon the Quran. إِلَّا أَنَّ ذَلِكَ ثَقِيلٌ عَلَى النُّفُوسِ. But unfortunately that's heavy for the egos. وَالْفُضُولُ خَفِيفٌ عَلَى الْقَلْبِ. But idle talk is easy for the heart. وَالْعَامِ يَفْرَحُ بِالْخَوْضِ فِي الْعِلْمِ. And an ordinary person tends to love diving into scholarship. إِذِ الشَّيْطَانُ يُخَيِّلُ إِلَيْهِ أَنَّهُ مِنَ الْعُلَمَاءِ. So that the shaitan deceives him into thinking that he too is a scholar. وَمِنْ أَهْلِ الْفَضْلِ. And is a person of religious merit. وَلَا يَزَالُ يُحَبِّبُ إِلَيْهِ ذَلِكَ حَتَّى يَتَكَلَّمَ فِي الْعِلْمِ بِمَا هُوَ كُفْرٌ. And the shaitan continues to make this delicious for him until he starts to talk about the religious sciences in a way that actually includes expressions of kufr. وَهُوَ لَا يَدْرِي. And he simply doesn't know. وَكُلُّ كَبِيرَةٍ يَرْتَكِبُهَا الْعَامِ فَهِيَ أَسْلَمُ لَهُ مِنْ أَنْ يَتَكَلَّمَ فِي الْعِلْمِ. Whatever mortal sin an ordinary Muslim might commit is less dangerous and is safer for him than to talk about technical matters of religion. لا سيما فيما يتعلق بالله وصفاته. Especially issues of metaphysics, anything to do with the divine nature and attributes. وإنما شأن العوام الاشتغال بالعبادات والإيمان بما ورد به القرآن. What is right for ordinary Muslims is to busy themselves with worship and to believing in what is stated in the Quran, وَالتَّسْلِيمُ لِمَا جَاءَ بِهِ الرُّسُلُ. And simply to acquiesce in what the messengers have brought. مِنْ غَيْرِ بَحْث. Without going into them in depth. وَسُؤَالُهُمْ عَنْ غَيْرِ مَا يَتَعَلَّقُ بِالْعِبَادَاتِ سُوءُ أَدَبِ مِنْهُمْ. And for them to question about things other than what is sort of basically necessary in their ibadah is discourteous in them. يَتَعَرَّضُونَ لِخَطَرِ الْكُفْرِ. And by doing so they expose themselves to the danger of disbelief. وَهُوَ كَقَوْلِ سَاسَةِ الدَّوَابِ عَنْ أَسْرَارِ الْمُلُوكِ. It is like a camel or donkey drover asking about the secrets of kings. وَهُوَ مُوجِبٌ لِلْعُقُوبَةِ. Which could well cause the king to punish them. وَكُلُّ مَنْ سَأَلَ عَنْ عِلْمِ الْغَامِضِ لَمْ يَبْلُغْ فَهْمُهُ تِلْكَ الدَّرَجَةِ. Whoever asks about some subtle and obscure scholarly thing and his understanding has simply not reached that degree, فَهُوَ مَذْمُومٌ. He is to be condemned. فَإِنَّهُ بِالْإِضَافَةِ إِلَيْهِ عَامِي. Because he is in relation to that an ordinary person. So even if you're a scholar, you're an alim, and you're trying to get into some really obscure interpretation of Ibn Arabi, for instance, you should know that that's reprehensible if you haven't studied that, and you are in that particular ilm, that particular science, not considered a scholar. You are just an ammi, just an ordinary Muslim. قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم ذروني ما تركتكم فإنما حلك من كان قبلكم بكثرة سؤالهم واختلافهم على أنبيائهم. Those who came before you were destroyed only because of their many questions and their endlessly going back to in questions to their prophets. ما نهيتكم عنه فاجتنبوه وما أمرتكم به فأتوا منه ما استطعتم. Whatever I forbid you, avoid, and what I command you to do, obey those commandments as much as you are able. With that very important point, because nowadays in particular the boundary between authorized and unauthorized religious discourse has been almost abolished, and some major scholar might appear on a YouTube clip, for instance, talking about Al-Juwayni's arguments for the ontological status of the letters of the Quran, and immediately within a day every last kebab seller from Marrakesh has put his opinions on there, and you can see this is a real defacement Somebody sent me just 2 days ago a video clip on YouTube of Sheikh Ali Jum'ah, the former Mufti of Egypt, talking about whether or not a wali is infallible. And he said, no, a wali is not infallible. It's theoretically possible that a wali can sin and that he could possibly slip and commit a sin. And immediately all of these wild people start to attack him, saying, oh, he's saying that once you're a wali, it doesn't matter if you commit a sin. Complete misunderstanding. And there's already 60,000 hits on that particular out of context clip. And this is a real plague. We've lost our respect for the ulama, and we think that we can make things up for ourselves, and that everybody is now mujtahid. Everybody is authorized to have the definitive opinion on everything that might be historically debated or subtle. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to put us in our places and to help us to find the peace of mind and the serenity of heart that comes from humility. And this is a great gift. And not to feel put out or inadequate because we haven't studied something, or we don't know something. And simply to say, I don't know, rather than allow the nafs to have its way and to pretend that we have a view on a particular subject, because that's lethal. And that's exactly the afa, the defect, the 20th defect, which Imam Al Ghazali is talking about. What you don't see in the comments after the YouTube clip is Allahu A'lam or La Adri, I don't know. Nobody any longer in the ummah seems not to know anything. We've all become allama, all become a great scholar. And this is one of the fitnas of our time, and it's foretold in the hadith of the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So alhamdulillah, we've come to the end of what I think is a very relevant and brilliant achievement of moral theology, practical ethics. Because there's hardly anything in this that doesn't directly apply to ourselves, despite the distance in time and place that separates us from the great Imam. His writing in Central Asia 900 years ago, that's a considerable cultural distance. This speaks to us directly, and that's part of the greatness of the Ihya, which is that it is still, as a book, a spiritual guide. It is still something that can change us, and one of the essence of what we are, it's of the spirit, its locus is in the ruh. So one of the ways in which outward theology and this inward theosophical science of illumination, of kashf, are brought together in Ghazali and in Ghazalian Islam is in this doctrine of the soul and its acquisition of certain actions. And the doctrine of kasb is where our philosophical theology dovetails with our mysticism. And of course the law as well, because innamal a'malu binniyat, actions are only by intentions, and the intentionality of an agent is one of the most important things that the jurists discuss. Whether simply saying, I intend to perform the prayer, constitutes a valid prayer or not, even if your mind is elsewhere. When you say that, it's an issue also for the jurists. So this issue of intention, which really is the fundamental concern of the Ihya Ulumuddin, is the principle whereby Islam brings together these three very different dimensions, which are the dimensions of Islam, Iman and Ihsan. That is to say, the dimensions of outward practice, the Sharia, and inward affirmation, Iman, doctrine, and the spirit, Ihsan, doing things beautifully, recognizing the beautiful, and hence the spiritual, which is the inward tasawwufi dimension. And the Imam is our greatest theorist of how those three things come together. They're not in competition with each other. Oh, he's very Sharia oriented, he's not into tasawwuf, is a kind of misunderstanding of how Islam works. The more you have of any of these three things, the more you have of the others. And this is very much the perspective of the Imam, and it's the perspective of Sunni Islam generally. So this is why he spent so much time on these fine distinctions about what to do with praise, how to deal with backbiting, how to respond if somebody is attacking you or praising you. All of these things might seem to be small questions of pastoral theology, but in fact they're all essential. They're a part of his large package of ulum al-akhirah, the sciences of the other, the sciences which bring one safely to the real world, not this world of smoke and mirrors, but the real world, the world of haqa'iq, which lies beyond the curtain of death. And this book is simply a manual helping us to come to terms with the miracle of our consciousness so that we use it rather than just allow it to slide around. Attentiveness is essential in his system. Intention is essential. What we do with others and our bodies, which is what the Sharia is for, and how we can, to the best of our capacities, conceptualize holy things, which is the function of the science of theology and metaphysics in particular. And the Imam in this book shows how all of those three things dovetail and become part of a single, not even synthesis, but a vindication of the Quranic vision which brings them all together. Because in the Quran, fiqh is not some kind of separate issue from what happens at the end of time. What happens at the end of time is not a separate issue from the divine names. It's not separate from the requirement of tawbah. In all of these things, all of these things are collapsed together and become a single principle in the Quran. And when you listen to the Quran in Taraweeh, you see how those subjects follow one another in quick succession, but in a way that's harmonious. And that's the essence of the Islamic vision. It's an integrated vision of religiosity. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us something of that integrated vision, to make us people of balance, to make us people who are at ease with our beliefs, with our bodies, with others, and with our souls. And inshallah that the light that is transmitted to this ummah through the example of the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and a spiritual connection with him will become manifest in our lives, in our faces, in our actions, in our families, inshallah, rather than just remaining a matter of speculation or of theory. Barakallahu fikum wal afu minkum. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. So I will be, as I say, be having a Q&A session at 10 o'clock this morning, inshallah, for those of you who wish it. Assalamu alaikum.